Welcome to ideamix Performance and Wellness, where world-leading coaches and scientists explain how their research can help you achieve your personal and professional goals faster.
Thanks for joining us today. At ideamix, we transform businesses and professionals with performance coaching for teams and individuals. We started our company to solve three problems in coaching. One, to curate experienced coaches. Two, to create excellent, replicable coaching results for all the leaders we work with across industries. And three, to measure return on coaching with hard data. It's why we have a 100% satisfaction rate among our clients, with transformative results for leaders and quantifiable results for companies. If you want to talk more about coaching for yourself, your team, or your company, reach out to us at sam@ or jamie@theideamix.com. We help accelerate performance. Let us help you accelerate yours. Thank you, and now please enjoy our recorded event.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the ideamix Lunch and Learn event, The DNA of Peak Performance. I am your ideamix host, Jamie Kosmar, and hopefully you've joined us before and you've seen me. But if you're joining us for the first time, thank you for coming, and I hope you will join us at another future monthly event. ideamix Coaching is a leadership solutions and coaching provider that works with organizations, teams, and individuals to optimize performance and encourage transformative growth with coaching. At ideamix, we believe that human capital is an organization's greatest asset. And because of that, we've built our company around ensuring the adaptability and the development of your organization's leaders and teams by curating a network of high-quality coaches, focusing on ensuring coachee fit with one of those high-quality coaches, and creating a process to track and measure the success of the coaching journey. If you would like to learn more about what we do, how we do it, or just coaching generally, please reach out to me, jamie@theideamix.com, after today's event, or you can reach out to Sam Jayanti, sam@theideamix.com, or alternatively, you can, of course, visit our website, theideamix.com. Anyway, I am very excited to be joined today by Coach Alex Auerbach, who is going to be speaking with us about peak performance and performance coaching. The information he will share with us today is published in his book called To Greatness, where he draws on his expertise in performance psychology and his experience coaching professional athletes to help us understand how to be the best versions of ourselves. Just a little bit about Coach Alex before we get started and welcome him. He's been coaching for about 15 years. And then, of course, in addition to working with athletes in the NBA and the NFL, he is a performance psychologist who works with leaders and executives to help them perform at their best when it matters the most. He is very credentialed with a PhD in counseling psychology and a specialization in performance psychology, and he has an MBA. In today's discussion, we will explore a framework of peak performance and how it can be used to drive performance, or as he says in the book, tilt the odds in our favor. So please join me in welcoming Coach Alex. I'm excited to be speaking with you today.
I'm happy to be here with you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
So I'm gonna start doing something a little bit different. This is the first time that we've ever done this on one of our Lunch and Learns with a quick fire round of questions. And this is apparently for people with PhDs, this can be quite challenging because there's always a yes, but. But the idea, I will state something simple and you can either give a yes or no answer as to whether you agree or don't agree with it.
I can't give you an it depends. That's the classic psychologist answer.
Single word answer. So
Okay.
why don't we go ahead and get started with our quick fire round.
Let's do it.
Those who rise to the top of their profession or field, like pro athletes, have talent that most others don't have that got them there.
Yes.
Working hard is the best predictor of high performance.
No.
Success is something we achieve alone.
No.
Stress is bad for performance.
No.
Mental strength is the ability to persistently push through things.
Yes.
We should not compare ourselves to others if we want to build confidence.
It's like a double negative in there, I think, but yes.
Um, Improvement comes from working on weaknesses.
Yes and no.
That was a two-word answer. There is one path to being the best.
No.
Honing one's mental skills is the key to achieving peak performance.
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you. How was that? Was that hard?
Not too bad. I didn't know I was the first one you were doing this with, though, so I had no idea what to expect.
Yeah,
Thanks for
yeah.
the opportunity to experiment.
Well, I hope the audience enjoyed it and gave them a bit of a teaser as to what we're going to be discussing today. I would love to open up if you could just give us a little background about how you became interested in performance psychology and your overall experience working with pro athletes.
So I actually started my career as a college football coach. That's originally what I wanted to do. So I worked at the University of Arizona. I worked for a couple NFL teams, had a full-time coaching job at University of Rhode Island, and just kind of burned out of coaching. And so at one point went to a career counselor and was really enjoying that process and was like, I think I want to do what you do. And he said, well, you could do what I do, but you could do it in sports. And this sort of light bulb moment went off for me where I got to figure out that I could really do what I loved most when I was coaching, which was spend time with athletes one-on-one, helping them think through their plans or their lives. A little less time on X's and O's and technical and tactical stuff. And then, get to work on interesting problems like helping people unlock their full potential. And so went back to school, got my PhD, like you mentioned, in counseling psychology with basically a double major in sport and performance psychology. Came back to Arizona where I did my undergrad, took over the mental health and mental performance services there, and then most recently was the sports psychologist for the Toronto Raptors in the NBA. Now doing a little bit of work with the WNBA team that started in Toronto, the Toronto Tempo, and an NFL team I'm not allowed to name. But it's been a lot of fun getting to this point where a lot of my work is really about, again, helping people become the best version of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And could you share with us, we were talking about this a little before we started, but why did you decide to write this book called To Greatness?
There's like two real reasons behind it. The one we were talking about before was a general disenchantment with the fact that most self-help books, though I'm reluctant to put myself in that category. Most self-help books, I think, give you an overly simplistic view of what it would look like to actually get better at something. So if I think of the books that have become very popular, and this is no disrespect to those books, it's just sort of a fact. A book like Mindset, for example, is basically like one core concept written out across 13 chapters, as though that's like the one thing that you need to be successful, right? Or you've got other examples like that where there's sort of a pretty narrow view of what it takes to actually be good at something. And so, though the book, as you described it, might be rich with information, I'll change your language a tad, rich with information. There's a lot that is required to actually become excellent at something. Most of it is not all that complicated, but there are several steps you have to follow and things that you have to do if you really want to perform at the level of a pro athlete. And I know we've done some work together with executives. I think many of those same principles apply in coaching. And frankly, it's part of why coaching is useful, right? Is to have someone who can guide you through a more structured sequence of process to help you get to your full potential without you having to think about it all. And with, some expert guidance about what principle or process to leverage at any given point. So that was reason one, was like, I think people need to really understand what goes into becoming great at something. And probably the clearest example I can give of that in the book is the chapter on preparation, where I don't know very many other sports psychology books at all that talk about the science of skill acquisition, or leadership books that talk about how you actually get better at something. But if you're not practicing, you're not getting better at something. So you really can't skip that as part of the process to getting excellent. And so I thought it was important to include stuff like that. The second reason, and I'll keep this one short, was just that this was the book I wish I would have had in graduate school. When I was going through my training, I was searching for like who's got the best way to think through some of these things, and the closest thing I found was Stephen Kotler's The Art of Impossible, which is also a great book on peak performance. But there's really not much out there that helps you think through it in any real concrete sequential way with action steps, and so that's what I try to do.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, I just want to follow up on one of your points, the first one in particular, about the fact that when we see people who are performing at their best, there's been a lot that has gone into these singular moments. And it's not just by happenstance or chance or luck or talent alone that puts them in those moments. I think that our human brains tend to be very reductionist of how we like to evaluate things. And so chalking it up to one idea like mindset, for example, is just that. So I would agree that your book very much encompasses everything that it takes. And one of the quotes that I really love from it is, "It's simple, but not easy." Which is true. There's a lot of effort and hard work that goes into performing at a high level. Anyway, so why don't we get into the idea of what performance is and how everyone should be thinking about this, how they should frame it in their minds, and how we can all build our personal capacity to perform, generally speaking.
Awesome. Yeah, lots in there. So I'll try to organize it neatly for us.
Yeah.
So in general, the way I think about performance is you have two types of performance. The first is what you might call typical performance, and that's how you do on a day-to-day level, right? It's like you're going through your work week and you show up Monday through Friday. How are you performing basically every day? So it's managing your meetings, your direct reports, leading your team, whatever it might be. Or if you're a pro athlete, it's how you get through practice or the regular games that you play. And to get really good at this type of performance, you need a few key things that sort of sustain your well-being, keep you progressing over time, help you persist and push through difficulties, because everyone's familiar with just sort of the day-to-day challenges of leading a team or running a business or whatever it might be. And so I think you've got to build some specific skills and qualities that help you manage the average day, if you will. And if you can, as you get better at building those qualities, your typical performance improves over time. And ideally for a performance coach like me, you're trying to help people constantly go sort of like up and to the right. The second type of performance is what we call maximal performance, which is what people typically think of when they think of peak performance, right? It's like the high pressure moments or the big moments where everything seems to come together and you need to perform at your best, right? It's the pitch to your big investor. It's the last minute shot that Michael Jordan hits, to win the championship, right? It's Serena Williams, clutching it at Wimbledon. It's those moments where we like watch someone do something amazing and we think, wow, how did they do that? And there's a different set of skills that's built on that first foundation of the typical performance skills that you leverage in those high intensity moments to help yourself perform really well. And you've mentioned this or alluded to it, a few times, but the way I think about a lot of performance is that most of it requires several things, right? Teamwork, luck, hard work, talent. You've got a lot going on, and most performances are what I would describe as odds-based events. Like no one goes out there for an NBA game, let's say, and wins 100% of the time. So the best that you can do is sort of control some of these variables around your mindset or your physical preparation or whatever it might be to give yourself the best chance to be successful. You're not going to win 100% of the time. If any of you watch the Roger Federer speech at Dartmouth for the graduating students, he talks about winning 80% of his matches, but only 54% of his points. Like you're going to lose often, even if you're one of the greatest of all time. But figuring out how you navigate that and improve your odds of being successful, I think, is what separates the best from the rest. And there are a few people that agree with me on that are much more talented performers than I am. So that's sort of the kind of the foundation of understanding peak performance from the perspective of a performance psychologist, and the way I think about, again, a lot of the coaching that I do and how I help people get better, because most days are going to be typical performance. And so if you want to become excellent at what you do, you've really got to figure out how to get the most out of that. And then you've got to be ready for the moments when the pressure is highest.
So basically, you on a day-to-day focusing on how you show up and how you perform in the grind, shall we say, actually then can help your success in those peak moments. So there is a direct correlation between those two.
I think so. I mean, I think if you build the right foundation of skills that helps you get better and better over time, your capacity to perform well at those most intense moments is just going to be greater. So an easy parallel to draw is maybe like strength training, right? If you want to run, let's say you want to run like a 6 minute mile, or you want to bench press 315 pounds or whatever it might be, like reaching that milestone, that peak performance is going to be facilitated by progressive training to get to that point and building up to that level of performance. And mental performance or high performance from a mindset perspective is really no different. You want to build the foundational strength, if you will, mental strength, to
Hmm.
have the ability to then withstand the pressure and perform well at those highest intensity moments.
Hmm. And when we think about typical performance, in your book, you reference the building blocks of wellness. I think wellness is very naturally associated with sports, and some of these things we naturally associate with sports. But I think it's worth discussing when we think about just general life. So, do you want to just talk to us a little bit about sort of what these building blocks of wellness are and why they're so important for performance?
Sure. So the reason that they're important is because they facilitate the development of what's called adaptive capacity, which is basically your ability to take on higher, harder challenges over time. So if you think about your own progress or growth, if you want to get a promotion or reach the next level in the way you think about leadership or help your team do the same, the basic principle is you like need to introduce them to a little bit of stress, then give them some time to recover, help them make sense of what they've just went through, consolidate that learning, and then they'll be ready to take on something harder. Again, if you draw a parallel to strength training, muscles work very similarly, right? A little bit of stress paired with rest and recovery leads to the ability to take on more over time. So that rest and recovery is really mostly what wellness is about, right? It's how do you give yourself an opportunity to recharge, re-energize, manage your emotional highs and lows in a way that's sustainable. And I think this is particularly true in corporate spaces, right? Or business spaces where, if you've got a leader who's emotionally dysregulated, let's say, right, like that has a huge impact on the team. If you got an NBA player who's a little emotionally dysregulated, you just take them out of the game, right? But you can't take the CEO out of the business for a week just when they're having a hard time. So you've got to have these foundational skills that really allow you to manage your life effectively. And the key skills here are sleep, play, good nutrition, good movement, resilience, stress management, and self-awareness. I'll try to go through them all somewhat in an order, but keep it brief, so that we can kind of unpack them. So the first is sleep. Sleep is the single best performance enhancer we know. So if you take nothing else from this presentation, it's make sure you're getting good sleep and make sure the people that you coach or work with are getting good sleep. There's plenty of good science out there about what makes for effective sleep, so I won't spend a ton of time on that. But the basics are 7 to 8 hours, consistent bedtime and consistent wake time. And for what it's worth, consistent wake time, not early morning sunlight, though that's been popularized by some good influencers. Consistent wake time is the single best predictor of high quality sleep. And so if you get good quality sleep, what you get is better decisions, better emotion regulation, better interpersonal relationships. And there's even some data that suggests that leaders who have better post-work recovery and sleep have higher performing teams because they're a little bit less stressed. They manage their teams more effectively. And as a result, their teams are more creative and innovative in the work that they do. So sleep is the single best thing that you can do from an overall wellness perspective. Nutrition and movement are kind of the next two foundational pillars there. Again, you just got to eat well and move your body. There's, again, tons of research out there, but we know without a doubt that there's a connection between your gut and brain. And so what you eat does impact the way that you think and feel. And that good movement does facilitate higher functioning cognition, right? Like if you get a little bit of regular exercise, your mood's going to be better, but you're also going to make decisions more effectively. You'll be more creative. And exercise happens to be a great place to push yourself on some of these mental skills where you can build some of that adaptive capacity, which is awesome. And then play is kind of the fourth foundational element I often include, which is just that people need to have a good time once in a while. And so play is really this like self-directed, self-guided experience around something that you're interested in. It doesn't have to be, truly fun. It can be like tinkering with something or building something new or challenging yourself, but giving yourself an opportunity to experiment with something that does not have an evaluative component where you can explore your own interests, I think is really important. The next level are stress management, social support, and resilience. So, again, a high level, it's important to have really good relationships. Relationship quality is the strongest predictor we have right now of long-term well-being and life satisfaction. People basically feel best about their lives when they feel connected. And it's also a great buffer against stress or any sort of, really adverse circumstances. You've got to have good stress management and coping skills. Lots to get into there. So I'll sort of keep it brief by just saying the way you think about stress plays a huge part in the way that you cope with stress. We can talk more about that. But having skills to think effectively about stress and manage it when it comes up, is really important. And then the way I think of resilience is really this sort of consistent seeking of growth, even when conditions don't support it. People often talk about resilience as needing to be in response to a stressor. I don't think you always need something bad to happen for you to be resilient. Sometimes things just aren't going great, like you can't put your finger on it. You wake up on the wrong side of the bed. You're not feeling 100%. I always give the example from the sports world, right? Like you're on a 5-game losing streak. Like which of those 5 games was the adverse event? Like it's just generally crappy when you work in a sports environment and your team's lost that many in a row. And so it's just not going to feel great, but you still need to be thinking about how it is that you get better and the way that you push yourself. And again, all this is facilitated by the last element, which would be self-awareness, which is really understanding your own goals, needs, values, what you care about, and how you give it to yourself. The best athletes I've ever worked with and some of the best athletes I've been around, or seen on other teams, a lot of how they manage to keep themselves successful for so long is really understanding what they need, what their body needs, and have figured out creative ways to get that for themselves. So if you've read about like LeBron James, people will, talk about how he spends $1 million a year just on recovery processes. He'll dispute whether or not he spends that much time, that much money, but the principle holds, which is essentially like if you know what you need, you're going to invest in it, and that's going to facilitate long-term excellence.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that was a very quick and dirty sort of summary of the building blocks. I would love to sort of just delve into a little bit of this idea of how do you balance a high performance mindset with the need for fun, play, and recovery. And maybe let's make it real. Like, let's say you're a team leader, you've got somebody who is like that nose to the grindstone, willing to work all hours. Like how do you encourage that type of employee to take a moment to go and have fun and do something else?
I think the biggest change here is getting people to see what is initially perceived as kind of conflicting activities as mutually beneficial and reinforcing. So like, I'll use myself as a really clear example. When I was first coaching football, I was like walking off the field one day. I was super tired. And I said to one of the older coaches I was working with, like, man, I'm just exhausted. And he looked at me and he goes, you can sleep when you're dead. And it's like, okay, well, now understanding what I understand about sleep, it's like, first of all, you're going to kill me faster because I'm not sleeping enough. But second of all, like my performance is actually suffering as a function of not getting good sleep. And so rather than thinking of sleep as something that you do when you're dead, wouldn't it be more helpful to think of sleep as an investment in my performance tomorrow? And the same thing is true with play or any other kind of wellness activity or recovery activity. It's not time away from performance. It's time invested in being good tomorrow. And then you have to, round that out with good data, right? So there's plenty of studies now that show that people's performance at work in particular starts to plateau around 35 to 40 hours a week. At 55 hours a week, your performance actually suffers for each additional hour that you put in. And if you're sleep deprived, you misperceive the quality of your work in ways that are quite absurd. So it's this really sort of like vicious cycle, right? Where you're undersleeping, underperforming, underrecovered. You don't see that that's what's happening. And so you can't really like pull yourself out of it. And that's, again, where good coaching comes in to sort of help you realize that. But I think a lot of it starts with the mindset shift of these two things are not competing. These two things are synergistic, and one is an investment in the other.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I feel like we have a culture that promotes this idea of just working, and that's the more you work, the more productive you are. And this idea that there is actually a cap on that productivity, if you're not sort of taking care of yourself and not sleeping, it doesn't. I don't feel like it shows up often enough in our cultural context.
Yeah, I agree for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm curious as to whether, I mean, obviously in the sort of the working world, but do you also see that in the sports world as well, where like the sports world as well, they believe in this idea of just pushing to practice all the time to get better and not prioritizing sort of a recovery.
Definitely, and a lot of it comes from the mythology of some of the greats, right? So the best
Mm-hmm.
example is Kobe Bryant, who had his famed kind of 4 a.m. workouts, right? What no one ever talks about was all the naps Kobe took after his workout or how else he caught up on
Huh.
sleep. So all you hear is, he was up in the gym at 4 a.m. Like the best are all up in the gym at 4 a.m. So there would be times where I'd get to the Raptors training facility at 8 or 8:30 and there'd be a player in there already and he'd be like, "Man, I've been here since 3." I'm like, "What are you doing? Like, why are you here? Go home, go to bed. Like there's nothing more effective for you than sleeping, both from a like learning and muscle recovery standpoint, but also just for your own decision making and sanity standpoint." So it's definitely still kind of part of the sports culture. I mean, I've been part of coaching staffs that sort of glorify how little they slept or they're under recovery on their Aura rings or their Whoop bands. Like it's, a badge of honor to be in the red. So there's definitely work to do in that space. And I think a lot of it will be facilitated by helping people really grasp the value of some of these things. But
Mm-hmm.
there's a long way to go.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely, I still think, quite a countercultural message. Um, let's set sleep aside and play and fun, and let's move into the idea of stress, because stress management is something that people talk about, I feel like, all the time today. They talk about how it leads to burnout. And I would love for us to delve a little into what is the role of stress in performance.
Well, you're gonna get me on my soapbox. We could stay on stress for, the next 30 minutes, but
I actually think, though, it's worth talking about, because again, there's a lot of noise in our culture about stress, good stress, bad stress, and how it leads to burnout. So I feel like this is something that's worth spending time on.
100%. I love it. So I guess first it's helpful to step back and examine like what stress really is. So we've all been kind of conditioned, particularly if you grew up any later than like 1990, into this idea that stress is bad for you, right? Like stress is harmful, chronic stress is a problem. If you feel any stress, something is wrong with you. It's played out now in like our teenagers where we see anxiety, through the roof because they're stressed all the time. And a lot of that is a cultural narrative that we've created about the harmful effects of stress and particularly cortisol as part of the stress response. But from a scientific perspective, stress is just your brain and body preparing you to do something effortful. Cortisol is not a stress hormone. Cortisol is an energy hormone. It is just your body giving you the fuel that you need to respond to a specific stimulus. Where stress becomes problematic is really if you have no recovery. So the burnout part that you're talking about is really a function of
Hmm.
people being under recovered, not people being over stressed, though certainly people can have maladaptive or ineffective responses to stress. So I think it's important to just level set at first that a lot of what we think we know about stress or the common wisdom that's shared about stress is a bit misguided and honestly quite harmful for most people. And is part of the way that we, think through how we respond to stress at any given moment. Like all that narrative is playing in our head when we're experiencing pressure at work or dealing with something difficult. And unless
Hmm.
you consciously work through that and come up with some other tools for that, and I'm happy to share the way I do that, it can become sort of problematic. So at its most basic form, stress with no recovery is going to give you burnout. Stress with good recovery is going to lead to that adaptive capacity and lead to growth. And the stressor is like a critical part of having any of that happen, right? So you do need some stress if you want to get better at something. So the role it plays in performance, right, is it facilitates you taking on challenges, being exposed to something difficult, right, and then being able to overcome that and build the capacity to perform at a higher and higher level. If you think about the all-time great athletes, for example, a lot of them push themselves as hard as they can in practice because that's a mechanism for them stressing themselves. Then they're going to give themselves some recovery and they're going to get better and better as they get closer to game day. And this is, I do think, one of the things that separates kind of the best performers from the rest of the performers is how they willingly sort of put themselves into quote unquote stressful situations to allow themselves to perform better. So you absolutely need some stress if you want to get close to anything resembling peak performance. But a lot of how you manage stress comes down to a couple dimensions, but probably the most important one is what's called the challenge versus threat appraisal. And what this is
Hmm.
really about is the way that you make sense of the initial stressor you experience. You either experience it naturally as a threat, like, oh my gosh, I'm unsafe. This is going to be a problem. I might fall apart, or a challenge. Wow, this is something I've worked really hard to get to. This is an opportunity for me. And that dimension becomes really important for the way that your brain and body respond to whatever happens next. So when I work with high performers, a lot of what I'm teaching them is how to most effectively make a challenge appraisal when they're under stress. And it turns out that people really have three mindsets about stress. And then there are four ways to think about stress. So I'll walk you through both that impact the way that you respond. So the three mindsets are this idea that stress is debilitating, stress is something to will your way through, or that stress is enhancing. And this comes from a really cool line of research done with Navy SEALs going through what's called BUDS training, which is essentially this like grueling short period later on in SEAL boot camp where they hang out on a Coronado Island and like force themselves to hold their breath under cold water, like carry massive logs for miles, kind of thing. Like it's
Wow.
a very intensive process to get to sort of the final stage of becoming a SEAL. And what they found was that SEALs had these three mindsets. So if you have this mindset that stress is debilitating, which is the most common mindset, you appraise the stressor as a threat, right? You see stress as something to get rid of, something that's bad for you, something that's a problem. And the most effective way to get rid of stress in any of those situations is to just quit. Unfortunately, like if you want to become a Navy SEAL, quitting in the middle of training is probably not going to help you. Same thing is true if you're a pro athlete, right? Like being stressed and then thinking about, oh my gosh, how bad is this, is not going to help you perform any better. So SEALs who had this mindset, what they found was that they quit earlier and they hurt their teams, of course, because they said things that were unhelpful out loud about the stress that they were experiencing, right? Oh my gosh, this is so hard. And you probably experienced this, like if you've ever attended a workout class and you've had someone in your class who's just like, oh, this is awful. You know, like this person has
Yeah.
this stress is debilitating mindset and it actually is impacting your performance, even if you're annoyed with that. You know, it's still like part of the equation. The second mindset is one I see a lot in leaders, and it's this idea that stress is just something to will your way through. This is particularly true of older leaders that I've worked with, though, not to, you know, generationalize anything. It's just sort of a matter of fact, I think, about the work I've done. And when you have this idea that stress is something to will your way through, what you get is this interesting combination where individual performance tends to be fine, but team performance suffers because people just go into their own little tunnel. They take care of what's right in front of them and they stop engaging in helpful team related behaviors to facilitate high performance for the rest of the group. And again, this is the same pattern that they uncovered in SEALs, right? When the Navy
Mm.
SEALs had this will your way through it mindset, what they found was that their individual performance was okay, their team performance suffered. But in a team game, like being a Navy SEAL, you end up not making the cut if your team performance suffers, right? So it's still not like the exact right mindset to have. Even if you're fine, if your team is struggling, that's not great. And then the third mindset was this idea that stress is enhancing, right? So these are people who see stress as a challenge and actively embrace that as part of the experience that they're having. And what they found was that SEALs who have this stress is enhancing mindset, their individual performance improved and their team performance improved because they engage in helpful team related behaviors like talking about how fun it is to be going through this experience together or what an opportunity to show how hard they've trained, right? And that language for other people helps them internalize this same stress is enhancing mindset. It can take someone from, oh my gosh, this is terrible, to wow, what fun this is by hearing somebody else be in that headspace. And it turns out
Mhm.
there's really like four key ways to frame stress to get yourself into that stress is enhancing mindset. So the first is to appraise whatever the stressor is as excitement instead of nervousness, right? Most people, when they like have the sweaty palm or the racing heart or the sweaty hands, the first thing that comes to mind is like, oh, I'm nervous or I'm a little anxious. But anxiety, nervousness, and excitement share a lot of the same physiological markers. So if you can get yourself to call it excitement, like, oh, I'm excited about what's going on right now, you start to get a little bit more adaptive physiological and psychological responses to the stress. The second is to
Can I
frame.
just pause you for a
Yes,
second?
please.
So when I'm
Yeah.
reframing, because I think this is really important and really could be helpful for the audience. When I'm reframing, am I saying this out loud or am I saying this in my head and just aware of it? Like what's happening?
Both and, right? So if
Yeah.
you're with other people, it's really helpful to say it out loud. If you're not with other people and you're by yourself, you can say it out loud or keep it internal. There's good data that shows that actually speaking your self-talk out loud makes it more effective. So to the extent that you're comfortable, I'd encourage you to say it out loud in either context. But some
Mhm.
people feel weird talking to themselves out loud. So I can recognize that. But if you watch like the best pro athletes, pregame, if you're ever looking for like a world-class example of what this looks like, just Google or go to YouTube and type in Aaron Donald Super Bowl self-talk. And it's like before the biggest game of this guy's career, he's going through all four of these framings that I'm giving you out loud to himself. And then like teammates walk by and they hear him. And so he like repeats the same thing to his teammate, like he's saying to himself something like, just be great. And then his teammate walks by and he like grabs his teammate and is like, hey, just be great, And so you can see how like it can work in both ways. So again, I'd encourage the outward expression
The
because we know
vocal.
it's more
Yeah.
effective. But if
Okay.
it's all in your head, that's okay too. Cool.
Yes, yes, that answers my question. If you want to keep going with the tools.
Yeah, let me give you the final kind of three here, right? So
Yeah.
the second framing is seeing stress as a sign that you care. No one feels stress about something that's not important to them or that they don't care about. And so leaning into the fact that this is important to you can actually be pretty helpful. A lot of times people feel like the best way to sort of navigate a stressful situation is to do something like minimize it, right? Like, oh, it's not that big of a deal or whatever. Like, I'll just be fine. And like that doesn't help performance in the short term. You can't lie to yourself. And two, it's not really that helpful in the long term either. There's ways to cope with it if it doesn't go well. So it's like really learning to figure
Mhm.
out how you deal with disappointment if it doesn't work the way that you want it to work and giving yourself the best chance to be successful. And so seeing it as a sign you care versus minimizing it can be really helpful. The third framing is this is an opportunity or a challenge, right? This is a chance to show what I'm made of. It's an opportunity to demonstrate a strength. This is something I've worked really hard to get to. I can't wait to prove how good I am or how ready I am, whatever it might be. And then the fourth is a sign that you're determined, right? So if you're getting this experience, and this works particularly well for people who experience stress more physically, right? Like you really are tuned into your like increased heart rate or whatever it might be. Seeing it as like your body giving you that energy to be determined in your performance can help you channel that pretty effectively. So the four framings again are I care, I'm excited, this is an opportunity, or I'm determined. And if you can leverage one of those four ways of thinking about stress, you're going to find that you tap into that more stress is enhancing mindset. If you verbalize it, you're going to give that same mindset to your teammates, and your performance will improve as a result.
But just to be clear, then you only really need, these are different framings, but you really just embracing one of them should be enough.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would
Right.
encourage you to try them on and experiment,
Yeah.
right? And then whichever one like resonates most for you and feels most authentic is the one I'd latch onto and kind of use repeatedly.
Interesting. Interesting. I love this idea too, though, of like sort of sharing the energy by being vocal about it, particularly if you are working in a team environment. I think that that's very helpful. And I think a lot of times sort of we undervalue, for lack of a better phraseology, I'll say the power of positive thinking and then sharing that positivity and that positive thinking with those around you. Um,
Yeah.
Let's thank you so much. I think that's so helpful, sort of that deep dive that we did into stress. And again, because I think it's something that everybody feels, whether you're a professional athlete or a professional, career person. I would love to move into this idea, and again, this is underpinning typical performance, the idea of psychological flexibility, what it is, what its role in peak performance is. I thought it was a really important concept, and definitely very critical one.
Awesome. Yeah, well, this is one of my favorite concepts in the book too, so I'm glad you liked it. So psychological flexibility is really at its core, it's the ability to adapt or persist in pursuit of your values, and sort of pushing yourself even when things get hard to live in alignment with what's most important to you. And so there's several psychological skills that facilitate being able to do that. One is having clarity on your values and being willing to act in service of them, even when it's challenging. But then mindfulness really facilitates these other sort of four key pillars, which I'm happy to talk about. But to wind it back just 1 minute, I think this concept is so important because it's one of the few psychological concepts we have that's a pretty consistent predictor of well-being across space spaces. If any of you really like reading scientific research, I'm not sure, that it might just be me on the call, but if you do, there's a great paper called Psychological Flexibility as a Fundamental Aspect of Health. And it talks about how having this grounding in your values and the ability to navigate your internal experience in service of your values actually reduces things like high blood pressure, right? Or makes it easier for you to stick with things like treatment for diabetes or diets that facilitate greater health. So there's lots of really interesting research around this kind of core concept, which again is just the ability to kind of be adaptive and flexible in pursuit of what's most important to you and your values. And so the six kind of core processes that break up psychological flexibility. The first is values clarity, right? You have to know what's most important to you for you to be able to get after it, right? And so this is something I often do very early on with any of my clients, whether it's an athlete client or a corporate client or executive, or I work with some musicians and artists. Like same thing, we have to figure out what it is that's most important to you and why those things are important. There's no like right or wrong set of values. It's not about like getting them to identify something that I want them to identify. It's really about getting them to get clear on what's most important to them. And for it to be a value, it has to be this sort of long-term viewed characteristic you're trying to embody or build to. It's not a goal that you can reach, right? It's got to be this ongoing process of pursuing these values. Then the other processes sort of facilitate pursuing the values in the psychological flexibility model. The first process is what's called acceptance, right? Which is basically your ability to like deal with difficult emotions or discomfort in service of your values. So if you go back to the stress example we just talked about, like if you really value becoming a Navy SEAL, let's say, right? Or you value excellence and competition with your team, but you're not willing to accept the stress that you go through, you're going to quit early, right? You get this sort of stress is debilitating mindset. If you're able or comfortable or willing to withstand the emotional discomfort in pursuit of your values, that's really what acceptance is all about. And there's lots of cool things you can do to help people build greater acceptance. But my favorite is to sort of teach people how to ride the wave of the 90-second experience that emotion usually is, right? So when we have a feeling, it typically lasts about a minute and a half. The things that keep the feeling going on are all in your head. It's how you think about it. It's the story that you're telling yourself about what you feel. It's playing it over and over in your mind. But if you can let some of that stuff go and just sit with the 98-second experience, what you're going to find is that your emotion kind of like does a little peak and goes away. And so if you can teach people how to just sit with it and breathe into it and be more comfortable with it, and that facilitates some acceptance. The second process is what's called diffusion, which is basically the ability to more helpfully relate to your own thinking. So if any of you have ever practiced mindfulness, you've probably already practiced some diffusion in its own way, which is really just observing your thoughts as they come and go, right? But again, there's lots of creative things you can do to facilitate diffusion. And this is really important because there's lots of science around this, but the core of it is this idea that words have a disproportionate impact over the way that we think, feel, and behave in ways that are not always helpful for people, right? So often, if you've ever argued with your partner, you've experienced fusion, which is the opposite of diffusion, which is basically like you just believe everything you think is exactly right, and your partner's a moron, right? There's like no way that they would be right about whatever this thing is that you're fighting about, and you grow sort of like increasingly dogmatic about your view, right? Because you believe what you think. But it turns out that believing what you think all the time is actually not all that helpful, particularly when you think unhelpful or are things that are harmful to you, right? So, these are things athletes often think like, oh, you suck, or you're no good, or I can't believe you missed that shot. And everyone I know has had some negative internal dialogue like that. Being able to let that go and see it for what it is without getting attached to it facilitates high performance. And then the other two dimensions,
Can I stop you 1 second on
Yes.
just the diffusion point? Ever since I've been involved with ideamix in particular, I really learned this understanding of the inner monologue. And I just like in your experience, I would say that I have not personally been very aware of my inner monologue until very recently, which is a shame. And I would say to me, that's one of the values of coaching, is that coaching really can bring out that inner monologue because we aren't very aware. And I would just, is that what you find, that most people are not aware that they have these thoughts? They have this inner monologue that it actually impacts how they react and what they do.
Yeah, I think it's people fall on the spectrum, right, of how aware they are of their internal monologue and how it impacts them. But I would say in general, people underestimate how impactful this internal narrative is. And there's lots of
Hmm.
really interesting data on thinking, but like the core kind of interesting stuff to me is that we think somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 thoughts a day, and 48% of those thoughts are about the past or future, which is really not all that helpful, right? If you're a person who spends a lot of time thinking about something you can't change or something that may not happen, it's not super strong for facilitating peak performance. There's also some interesting data that shows that some people think more in like pictures than words, right? And that impacts the way that you interact with your internal monologue. But at its core, like you do need to raise your awareness of this. And then I think the second element of that is I do think people misperceive what they think is helpful to them, because it's really hard to sort of tease apart the impact of your internal monologue on your behavior. So a lot of high performers I work with believe, for example, that being really hard on themselves facilitates their excellence. And what you find is that being really hard on yourself can facilitate good behavior in the short term. It's just really damaging in the long term, right? So you've got this weird cycle where it's reinforcing because you're getting good behavior right away, and that's how behavior works. But in the long term, you're really suffering as a function of this, unhelpful monologue, right? And so you've got to help people not only uncover what they're saying to themselves, but then get more flexible with the way they think about what they say to
Yeah,
themselves.
and actually realize the impact of it, I think is really what's key and where coaching is very helpful.
Yeah, 100%. And there's, I mean, lots of really interesting things that we know about the impact of language on behavior or how people feel. But my favorite study on this comes from some coaches who were working with a basketball team. And what they basically ran two groups. One group had after a loss, the coach basically like yelled at them, which is a lot of what our internal monologue is anyway. And a lot of our internal monologue comes from people around us. And they found that coaches who yell after a game actually prolong the stress response in their team, the same way that this negative internal self-talk prolongs the stress response in our own body, and it delays recovery and delays subsequent performance. Coaches who sort of like come off the court and it's like, hey, it happens, like we'll get them next time, you're all right, like you tried your hardest, recovery kicks in much, much faster and you get better performance in the long run.
Hmm. Hmm. And was there one more? I think there was one more element that you were going to share with us. Values,
Yes.
clarity. Yes.
Yeah, so I'll kind of bundle two into one, but it's really the core of it is kind of mindfulness, the ability to be present and to sort of see your experience for what it is. So the technical
Hmm.
psychological term for that second dimension is called self as context. It's basically like understanding that you are more than just your thoughts and feelings, right? Like even though sometimes you feel really engulfed in your emotion or really engulfed in what's going on in your head, you contain those things. You're not the same as those things. And again, that's facilitated by a good mindfulness practice, which actually facilitates all four of those kind of core pillars, right? Good mindfulness practice facilitates acceptance, diffusion, presence, and seeing yourself as more than the sum of your experiences. And then allows you to engage in the fifth and final component of the six that I haven't talked about yet, which is committed action, right? Just like aligning your daily goals and behavior with what it is that you say you most care about.
Hmm. That's this is all like so one. I think the information is so rich and so interesting and fascinating and very helpful in terms of the framework. Because we're getting to the top of the hour, I do want us to touch upon this idea of peak performance, what it is, and what are the principles of it. Even if some of my other interesting questions we're not going to get the chance to get to.
Yeah, I'm happy to get into it. I'll give a high level overview since we're
Yeah,
running short on time. But
yeah.
the way I break down kind of peak performance is really about six things. I will say like my thinking has evolved a little bit since I wrote the book, so there might be more than six now, but that's okay. The first is good preparation, right? And good preparation really boils down to high quality practice and good mental preparation. So high quality practice, like you're putting in the reps to train the skill. There's three different types of practice I talk about in the book. For the sake of time, I won't go into all those three, but it's just important to recognize that what we often think is practice, like, repeating the same thing over and over again, is not the most effective way to develop a skill. And then you've got to have good psychological preparation, right? Goals, some kind of like pre-performance routine is something very common that I work with athletes and executives on. It's sort of like, how do you get yourself to the optimal psychological state for peak performance, right? And so a lot of
Hmm.
this is really about what happens before that peak experience. But if you want to have a chance to have a peak performance, like you do have to do some preparation situation. And again, this is one of the places I see most of the executives I work with in particular skip, and is one of like the highest leverage things I try to change as quickly as possible. I have a CEO right now I'm working with, for example, who tells me he never prepares before meetings. And so we just ran like a simple experiment where I asked him to set 10 minutes aside before he went in there and map out his thoughts. And his team said it was the best meeting he's ever run. It's like not that interesting of a thing for me to do. But, for him, it was like,
Yeah.
this sort of light bulb moment that like, oh, it
Wow.
matters if I go in prepared. The
Yeah.
second is full presence, right? So I call this principle immersion, but you really need to be in the moment if you want to have a chance at peak performance. So again, you've got all these thoughts in your head that could pull you out of the here and now. You need to figure out how you fully lock in and commit yourself to giving your all in the context of performance if you want a chance to be excellent at something. So again, this is about being fully present. It's about giving good effort. And it's a little bit about risking the possibility of failure, right? There's just a reality that things are not going to work sometimes. And that often holds people back from delivering in these big moments, right? The fear of failure, I think, is a pretty pernicious sort of thing that we all deal with. But if you bring that into these high intensity moments, it's unlikely that you're going to get exactly where you want to get. And that's where like the great Michael Jordan quote comes in, right? Like I've missed more than 900 shots or whatever, right? I've been trusted to take the game-winning shot 24 times and missed. It's like those things become really important. The third principle is really like psychological flexibility, again, packaged into the moment, right? So like, how do you deal with the onslaught of stimuli that you have in a given situation, right? You're giving a pitch to your board or you're raising money and an investor makes a weird face when you're talking. Like, how do you not let that derail you in the middle of what it is that you're doing, right? And being able to respond effectively to those stimuli becomes really important, like letting that go, staying present, being committed to what it is you're trying to do. Fourth is managing your energy. So, if I think about like a basketball game, right, you got 48 minutes that you're going to be out there running around. It ends up being something like 10 miles on average for most players. So a lot of running. You've got to find little ways that you can help yourself recover, that you can stay in the right headspace, that you can detach when you have an opportunity to detach. And for corporate folks, like this is why it matters to have 5-minute breaks between your meetings. I think by now, if you work with executives, you've seen that little image of the brain like melting through the series of back-to-back meetings. Like having just a little bit of a break helps you to facilitate optimal energy throughout the day, which again is just really important if you're trying to do something. And there's lots of little ways you'll see, like if you watch the NBA, you'll see players steal time essentially to get some rest and recovery, right? So they'll maybe run to the corner and grab their shorts, which is a sign like, don't pass me the ball right now, just leave me be. And this is a player taking some active recovery in the middle of a performance to help themselves stay good. And then the last thing is just resilience, which again is really about seeking kind of growth, but in this case is also about being able to deal with mistakes. And I think a lot of the ways that we've been trained to deal or think about mistakes are not helpful for peak performance. So the main one I'll touch on is the fact that most people believe that the best time to deal with a mistake is right after it's happened. And the reality is that we don't learn from failure all that effectively immediately after a mistake. I don't know about you guys, but most of the time, if I've made a mistake, my default response is to be like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, whatever. Like, oh, I'll get it next time. It's all ego defense, right? And this is pretty normal for most people. It's not a great time to learn. In the context of a basketball game, I don't really want you thinking about the mistake that you just made when you turn the ball over. I want you running back to play defense. So like we have to figure out how we deal with mistakes at the right time. And a lot of that comes back to being able to quickly let go of mistakes, be resilient to any adversity that you've experienced, continue to give good effort and trust yourself to perform well. So that's the really high level on the peak performance side.
Well, thank you so much, Coach Alex, for speaking with us today on peak performance. And this has been very enlightening, and the tools that you've brought to us, particularly, I think, around psychological flexibility and stress management and the role of stress, have all been very, very helpful. And unfortunately, we are not going to be able to entertain questions because we just had so much to cover today. But I want to thank you first and foremost, Alex, for coming to speak with us today. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us at this session. Just so you know, this session will be recorded or has been recorded. And so you will be able to access it after the fact, because I know Coach Alex covered a lot of great tools. However, also, if you would like to consider working with Coach Alex, please reach out to us at Jamie at the ideamix.com, or you can reach out to Sam at the ideamix.com. We would love to give you an opportunity to see if he's a good fit for you.
Thank you, Jamie, for the opportunity to share. If any of y'all have questions after, feel free to find me on social media. I'm happy to exchange ideas there too.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review. Find your ideal coach at www.theideamix.com. Special thanks to our producer, Martin Maluski, and singer-songwriter Doug Allen.